A $99 cube was supposed to overthrow Sony, Microsoft, and Nintendo. It promised the freedom of mobile gaming, the comfort of a television, and a console anyone could develop for. More than 63,000 people backed that promise before most of them had even seen the machine running. But less than 3 years after launch, the company behind it was effectively gone. The strangest part is that the Ouya did not fail because its central idea was ridiculous. It failed because the idea was so persuasive that millions of dollars arrived before anyone proved the product could work. If you enjoy digging through the promises and wreckage of consoles like this, subscribe to Cartridge Graveyard. And near the end, Ouya would make one decision that contradicted the very object it had raised $8.6 million to build. In July 2012, former IGN executive Julie Ehrman appeared with an irresistible pitch. Traditional consoles were expensive, closed, and slow. Smartphones had created thousands of independent developers, but their games were trapped on small touchscreens. Ouya would bring those games into the living room through a tiny Android console costing just $99. The hardware looked almost impossibly simple. Silver cube designed by Yves Behar, small enough to sit in one hand, connected to a television and controlled with a wireless gamepad. Every unit would also be a development kit, so owners would not need expensive licensing agreements or secret approval from a platform holder. Build a game, upload it, and let players decide. That was not merely a product pitch, it was a rebellion. Ouya asked Kickstarter for $950,000. It passed that goal in roughly 8 hours. By the end of the campaign, 63,416 backers had pledged $8,596,474, making it one of Kickstarter's biggest successes at the time. The campaign video showed famous developers praising the concept, while headlines called it a potential console killer. But crowdfunding had created a dangerous illusion. Raising money looked like market validation, but backing a futuristic idea for $99 was not the same as buying a finished console from a store. Kickstarter measured excitement. Ouya still had to manufacture reliable hardware, build an online store, attract developers, support customers, and compete against corporations spending billions of dollars. The money arrived in weeks, so expectations rose just as quickly. The company now had a crowd large enough to celebrate every promise, but also large enough to notice every crack. Those cracks became visible in December 2012, when early development units began shipping. The transparent plastic cases were intentionally unfinished, but the problems went deeper than appearance. Developers reported controller lag, buttons sticking beneath the faceplate, and analog sticks that felt imprecise. The user interface was rough, while basic software features were still missing. That might have been acceptable for a prototype, but Ouya had sold itself as a revolution arriving on schedule. So every flaw felt less like normal development and more like a broken promise. The controller became a perfect symbol of the problem. At a distance it looked familiar. 2 analog sticks, a directional pad, shoulder buttons, and 4 face buttons spelling O, U, Y, and A. But players described delayed inputs and inconsistent connections. A cheap streaming box can survive awkward menus. A game console cannot survive a controller that makes the game feel worse. Ouya tried to improve the hardware before the public launch, but backers were already receiving units in March 2013. Some retail customers would later find consoles in stores before early supporters had received theirs. These were the people who had funded the machine when it was only a rendering, so watching it appear on a shelf while their own order remained missing turned enthusiasm into resentment. The official retail launch arrived on June 25, 2013. On paper, the timing looked ideal. The PlayStation 4 and Xbox One were still months away, while Ouya cost less than a single premium console bundle. But the low price concealed a more damaging comparison. Inside the cube was NVIDIA's Tegra 3 processor, technology already used in mobile devices such as the 2012 Nexus 7 tablet. That was enough for simple Android games, but it could not compete with dedicated console hardware. Ouya therefore needed a different advantage, a library of distinctive games people could not stop playing. Instead, its open philosophy created a crowded and confusing storefront. Every game was required to offer some form of free trial, which sounded generous, but developers had to design demos, locked modes, or unusual payment systems whether those models suited their games or not. Players could sample almost everything, but sampling is not buying. Developers soon discovered that access to thousands of curious owners did not guarantee meaningful revenue. In one widely shared example, developer Matt Thorson revealed that Towerfall had sold about 2,000 copies on Ouya during its early months, generating roughly $21,000. Compared with many other Ouya titles, that was a success. Towerfall was fast, competitive, and perfect for a couch full of friends. But the game became far more famous after expanding to PlayStation 4 and PC as Towerfall Ascension. Ouya had helped prove the game was brilliant, but it could not keep the success for itself. Other developers reported far weaker results. Some earned only hundreds of dollars. A few earned almost nothing. So a brutal cycle began. Players wanted better games before buying the console, but developers wanted more paying players before investing in better games. Ouya needed one side to take the risk, yet its entire promise had been built around removing risk. There was another problem hiding beneath the hardware. Android was open, but television gaming was not simply mobile gaming on a larger screen. Touchscreen games had to be redesigned for controllers. Text had to remain readable from across a room. Multiplayer needed to work on a sofa. Menus needed to feel effortless. Ouya had treated the television as an empty screen waiting for mobile developers, but the living room was a different environment with different expectations. Still, the company searched for a breakthrough. In 2013, it announced the Free the Games Fund, a $1 million program that would match money raised by eligible Kickstarter campaigns. In exchange, funded games would remain exclusive to Ouya for a limited period. It was meant to create the library Ouya desperately needed. But because the matching amount depended on crowdfunding totals, campaigns suddenly had an incentive to inflate their support. Two projects, Gridiron Thunder and Elementary, My Dear Homes, attracted suspicion over unusual backing patterns. Critics questioned whether genuine communities had pledged the money or whether the system was being manipulated to unlock Ouya's matching funds. The company changed the program's rules, but the damage was already done. Ouya had positioned itself as the champion of independent creators, so controversy around an indie funding program struck directly at its identity. A technical failure can be repaired. A trust failure spreads. Meanwhile, larger competitors were absorbing the best parts of Ouya's argument. Sony actively courted independent studios for the PlayStation 4. Microsoft expanded its digital development programs. Cheap streaming boxes gained games, while smartphones became more powerful. The revolution Ouya predicted was happening, but the Ouya itself was becoming unnecessary. By 2014, the little cube was no longer framed as a console killer. Retail discounts appeared. But instead of fixing the hardware or replacing it with a stronger second generation, the company announced Ouya Everywhere, a strategy to put its software platform on devices made by other manufacturers. This was the decision that revealed how desperate the situation had become. $6 million to prove that its tiny cube could change console gaming. But now its survival plan required the cube to become optional. The company was no longer trying to win with its hardware. It was trying to escape from it. But software platforms depend on scale, and Ouya did not have enough of it. Reports later described financial pressure and debt. The company searched for a buyer, not from a position of strength, but because time was running out. In July 2015, gaming hardware company Razer acquired Ouya's software assets and technical team. Julie Ehrman left. Razer did not acquire the Ouya hardware business, so the cube that had promised to disrupt the console industry was effectively abandoned just 2 years after its retail debut. That is the big reveal behind Ouya's collapse. It did not really fool millions of customers into buying a useless box. It fooled the market into confusing demand for change with demand for this specific product. Kickstarter backers had voted against expensive, closed consoles, but Ouya interpreted that protest as permanent loyalty to Ouya. The company had captured a mood, not secured a market. The final ending came quietly. Razer kept the digital store alive for several years, but on June 25, 2019, exactly 6 years after Ouya's retail launch, the service shut down. Games that depended on account verification or store access could stop functioning properly. A console once celebrated for openness ended its life dependent on servers its owners could not control. But Ouya was not meaningless. It anticipated cheaper hardware, digital distribution, accessible development, free trials, and the growing influence of independent games. Its mistake was believing those ingredients automatically formed a successful console. They did not. Great platforms need trust, polished hardware, sustainable economics, and at least one experience people cannot get anywhere else. The Ouya Cube now sits on shelves like a tiny monument to internet optimism. Brushed aluminum, 4-lettered buttons, and an enormous promise packed into 3 inches of hardware. It reminds us that being early can look exactly like being right, until the future arrives without you. Would you have backed the Ouya in 2012, knowing how it ended? Share your answer below, and subscribe if you want more stories about the technology that promised to change everything.